Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see everyone. We have a very important topic today. I do want to clarify that I might have told someone, my mother, that you were from AAUW, but you're from the League of Women Voters. And not to worry, my mother supports both of those fabulous organizations. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about our presenters. Joyce is a member of the League of Women Voters of LaGrange area, where she has served as the director of voter registration and as a board member. Joyce is a founding member of the League of Women Voters Deerfield Electoral College Committee, created during the 2017 biennial convention of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. She's given a lot of presentations. Joyce has a 30-year career in advertising and marketing research, so she is very comfortable with statistical and census-based analysis. Rosemary is a retired teacher who has been a member of the League of Women Voters for 42 years. She joined in elementary school, first in Glenview, and now is a member of the League of Women Voters, Deerfield, Lincolnshire. She's active in other levels of the league, including the Lake County League and the Illinois League State Board. She has served in many League of Women capacities, including their moderator for numerous candidate forums. In 2017, she co-founded the League Committee, whose goal is to educate public about why we should abolish the Electoral College by constitutional amendment. And I am very, it's so pertinent to today as the midterms are heating up. So without any further ado, here's Rosemary and Joyce.
Hello, well, thank you so much for inviting us. Joyce and I are so happy to be here, and we see some of our friends in the audience. I won't mention their names because you're recording it, but we've had a lot of support from League members and the community for our presentation. And as you said in the introduction, we've been working on this since 2017 because the League of Women Voters seems, and we believe, is a perfect vehicle to bring this point of view to the public. The League has had this position since 1970. So we'll get started. Joyce, you're going to run the slides, and then I will do the first part, and then Joyce will do the last 2/3. So let's go to the next page. So we're going to give you a little introductory information, talk about the League of Women Voters of the United States position, and a few basic facts about the Electoral College, and also a little bit of the history and its racist roots. Then we'll talk about the vulnerabilities that have been discovered in recent years that people didn't realize existed in the Electoral College system for electing the president and vice president. And then this slide was used at our convention. So we have a little bit of exciting information, especially for our League members, as to the results of what happened at convention. And then we'll take, this was convention of the League of Women Voters of the United States, which was last June in Denver. And then we'll take questions at the end. So go ahead, Joyce. So we have an interleague electoral college committee, which is, it's kind of an ad hoc committee, and we've gotten a lot of interest from different leagues in Illinois, and we've recently added league members from other states who are working with us. So we're spreading throughout the nation, and but I will say the League of Women Voters Deerfield Lincolnshire has been one of the lead leagues. And again, our members in the audience, we appreciate your support all these years. Okay, next. Joyce, the next one then. All right, so here's some of the things we've done. We've created educational presentations with scripts and handouts. We have a speakers bureau. We've traveled to other communities throughout Illinois. And now with Zoom, we've been able to give our presentation to organizations and groups all over the country. So that's the only good thing that's come out of the COVID pandemic, is that people have become accustomed to using Zoom, and it does give us an opportunity to share our message. We have materials, we've reached a lot of people, And we will be working with LWV of the United States as part of a nationwide program, probably starting in the beginning of the new year. So keep your eyes open for that. Okay, next. So here's our position. Now, the League, for those who don't know about the League of Women Voters and their positions, it's a long, drawn-out process. So to achieve, let's say, a national position, national adopts a study at a convention. So the delegates have to approve that they even want to study a topic. Then the questions are prepared by national committee. Then leagues all over the country do their own studies, come together, have meetings, decide how they stand on the various questions in the study, send it back to national, and then the national board takes all the input from all those leagues and comes up with a position. So the League of Women Voters positions are not just casually adopted. It's a result of study and consensus by leagues all over the country. So when we say we have a position, we have something to stand on that is widely accepted in our organization. So in 1970, the League of Women Voters adopted this position, that the direct popular method for electing the president and vice president is essential to representative government. The League of Women Voters believes, therefore, that the Electoral College should be abolished. And that is the position that we are using as the foundation for our efforts. Okay, so what has happened over the years? In the 70s, we aren't going to talk about it too much in this presentation, but some of you might remember that George Wallace ran as a third-party candidate in 1968. And he almost was successful in getting enough, well, he thought he would, in getting almost enough electoral votes that would cause none of the three candidates to have a majority, in which case it would have gone into, the election would have gone into the House of Representatives. And so there was rather a panic in the country over this possibility. And so there was an interest in abolishing the Electoral College in 1970 that was pretty strong. Birch Bayh brought an amendment to the Congress, and it actually passed in the House of Representatives, but it was defeated by filibuster in the Senate. And at that time, that's when the League adopted this position in 1970, and we testified and lobbied to pass the resolution. Unfortunately, did not make it through the Senate. Then in the 90s, next slide. In the 90s, the League presented testimony before the House Subcommittee on the Constitution when there was another effort to, you have to pass a resolution in both houses of Congress by 2/3. And then after that resolution is passed, then it goes to the states for three quarters of the states have to ratify. So we testified in the 90s, again, not successfully. And then the next slide. In 2001, the League sent a memo to all the states, that this, outlining the League's position. So there was an effort to rouse up some interest. Next slide. And then in 2018, with our committee in the lead, we passed a resolution urgently reaffirming the League's long-held position that the Electoral College should be abolished. And then lastly, at this convention, we had an announcement that the League was going to focus on, this is 2020. We voted to make it a front burner effort, and that was in 2020, and then the results in 2022, which we were successful in getting LWVUS behind this effort in a more aggressive manner. All right, next slide. So how does it work? All righty. So of course, we know the Electoral College is not a place, it's a group of electors. And each state gets a specific number of electors based on their congressional delegation. So there's one elector for each US senator and representative. So Colorado had 9 electors in 2020. The District of Columbia, even though it's not a state, does get 3 electors for president. According to the US Constitution, each state legislature gets to decide how their electors will be chosen. Initially, state legislatures just picked the electors themselves. Over time, they started changing to choose electors by popular election. Importantly, the winner of the Electoral College is not whoever gets the most electoral votes. The winner must have a majority of the electoral votes. Currently, it's 270 to win. If no candidate gets 270 votes, the US House of Representatives chooses the president, with each state having just 1 vote. So what this means is, if you had a situation where none of the candidates achieved that magic majority number, it goes into the House of Representatives. The entire delegation of New York gets 1 vote. All 50-some delegates of California get 1 vote. So they have to come to an agreement or vote within their delegation. All 20 delegates from Illinois get 1 vote. That person in Wyoming gets 1 vote. So it's a system that really put a lot of power in the hands of the individual states as opposed to the people. Okay, next. So unless you've been an elector yourself, which we know a couple of electors, no one in this room has ever voted directly for a presidential candidate. When you cast your vote in November, you are actually voting for a group of people who have been chosen by the political parties to vote for their party's candidates. A few states list the names of these electors on the ballot. So you see here in this Arizona ballot, they have it clearly laid out for the people. If you were to vote for the Trump-Pence ballot, you see all those names of the people that are the electors from Arizona for the Republican Party. And down here, Clinton and Kaine, you see the same thing, and then all those others. Most states don't do that. Most states will just put the names of the candidates. So people don't realize that they are not actually voting for the candidates, but they're voting for the electors. Okay, next. The official presidential election happens on the Monday after the 2nd Wednesday in December. That's when all the electors meet within their states to officially cast their votes. Every state except Nebraska and Maine have chosen a winner-take-all system. Now, again, you notice the legislatures had voted, some put it in their constitution, some it's just a bill, that most of the states said, well, we'll have winner-take-all, we'll get all the electors. But that's not necessary, and that's going to become pertinent in Joyce's part of the conversation. And as an example, Nebraska and Maine don't do it that way. They have their states divided into districts. So it is winner take all in each district, and then they have at-large electors for the state. But all of that is up to the individual states how they want to handle choosing the electors. Then each state sends certificates of the vote to the US archivist in Washington, D.C., who then sends them to Congress, to the US Congress. On January 6th, Congress meets in a joint session to count and certify the electoral votes. The vice president, as president of the Senate, presides over the count and announces the results of the Electoral College vote. During this meeting, now they've changed this a little recently with the new version of the Electoral Count Act, but they still have some provision for this. Members of Congress can object to the electoral votes from any state. Up until now, it's been 1 senator and 1 representative. The new Electoral Count Act, which is not passed, but it passed the committee and it's being proposed as a bipartisan amendment, will change that a little bit so it requires more, but there still is the option for objection. And if so, then Congress has to consider. In the past, in 2017, so before the election that we're familiar with recently as 2017, Democratic representatives objected 11 times, but no senator joined them. And I already explained about what happened if the candidate does not get the 270 majority. All right, next. So that's the Electoral College process. Now, I'd like to focus your attention on 3 ways on which the Electoral College system is different than the popular vote system that's used in every other election in our country. There are 3 pillars of a democratic popular vote system. 1, the people vote directly for their representatives, like senators, representatives, governors, mayors, etc. 2, each person gets 1 vote, no more, no less. And finally, the candidate with the most votes from the people wins the election. So that's how we handle every election in this country, except for president and vice president. The Electoral College system violates each of these principles. First, as we've seen, using the Electoral College system means that we vote indirectly, not directly, for the president and vice president. Secondly, 1 person does not equal 1 vote under the Electoral College system because a vote carries more or less weight depending on which state the voter happens to live in. The reason for this, briefly, California, let's say they have approximately 50 representatives, and then so they had 50 electors plus 2 more for senators. So 50, let's say 52, that might not be exact. Well, you add those 2 more, it doesn't increase the value per voter of their influence on the Electoral College system. But Wyoming, which is so sparsely populated, has only 1 representative. So they have 1 electoral vote for that representative, and then 2 more for the 2 senators. So now you've tripled the number of the weight of each vote in Wyoming compared to California. So that's why that weight is not the same. And third, the candidate who receives the most vote in our November presidential election may or may not wind up living in the White House. Okay, next. There are many more reasons that the Electoral College is bad for democracy, but we'll only mention a few. It makes people feel, correctly in many cases, that their vote doesn't count. Data shows that voter turnout is significantly lower in so-called safe states, which is the majority of the states. Candidates focus their time, money, and policy positions on the handful of swing states. It polarizes our nation by pitting states against states, and it makes us more vulnerable to election fraud, as we clearly saw in the 2020 election. We'll talk about that more later. We can abolish the Electoral College by amending the Constitution, just as we've done with other amendments 27 times in the past. And I already told you it takes a 2/3 vote in both houses, followed by ratification by 3/4 of the states. It does not, just because there's been some confusion, we are not talking about an Article 5 constitutional convention. We're talking about a plain, straight out amendment to the Constitution, of which we already have 27. You've already heard a lot about the problems with the Electoral College, but you may also have heard people who say, yes, yes, all of this is true, but here's why the Electoral College still makes sense. We'd like to walk you through the most common myths and misperceptions about what the Electoral College does and does not accomplish, and how it's impacting our democracy. These are not just fringe theories, by the way. These are the main points that supporters of the Electoral College use to defend this antiquated system, and none of them stand up under scrutiny. And Joyce, is this where you wanted to jump in and take over the myth part?
Sure, if you'd like me to.
Sure, go right ahead.
So, as Rosemary said, these are, and they're kind of in order of like how frequently we hear them. So the number one counter argument against abolishing the Electoral College is that without the Electoral College, our presidents will all get chosen by a couple of big states, and they inevitably cite California and New York. So let's go through the numbers and see if that could be possible. Well, the first thing we'd like to point out that I always do is that California and New York may be the most democratic states, the largest democratic states, but they are not the largest states. California is number one, followed by Texas, which tends to vote Republican, and Florida, which is usually a toss-up state or a swing state, and then New York. The other thing that we like to put out or to point out is not everybody in those states, despite those horrible maps that paint an entire state as red or blue to stand for Republican or Democrat, every state, including California and New York, has both Republican and Democratic voters. So you can see here the popular vote in 2020, 34% of Californians voted Republican in that election. And that is millions and millions and millions of people. The other thing we'd like to point out is to just go back to an actual election. So we went back to the 2012 election for Barack Obama, and through the Federal Elections Commission report, we could look up specifically how many popular votes came from each state. So in this graph, it's additive. So we start with California. So that bar on the left shows all of the popular votes from the state of California for Barack Obama in 2012. The green line is we could, after the election, we could see based on how many people voted. In order to win the popular vote, Barack Obama would have needed 63.4 million votes. So we started adding up. So next, the second column down at the bottom, we added New York to California. The bar got a little bit bigger. Then we added Florida and Texas, and you can see we are still very, very far from that green line. We don't even get close to that green line until we're well over 35 states. And you can see it's not until the bar turned green, which is when we added little Nebraska to the total, that Barack Obama would have cinched and won the popular vote for president. So if you add up all of those states, he would have needed votes from 39 states in order to win the popular vote. And that's because we have voters in every state, as we said, who vote for Democrats, and we have voters in every state who vote Republican. So it takes a lot of agreement before someone can actually win the popular vote. So the fact is that in a popular vote system, votes from all states would be valued. An election by popular vote means every vote counts and counts equally no matter what state you come. The second myth is that smaller, less populated states need the protection of the Electoral College to ensure their interests are represented by the president. And this is a myth that's been around for a long time. And certainly when the Constitution was written, there was some talk about how smaller populated states didn't want to be, overwhelmed by the larger states. But let's look at the numbers and see what really happens. So first of all, we'd like to point out that small states do not vote as a block. And in fact, we looked at in 2016, the smallest 16 states and the largest 16 states and looked at which candidate they voted for. And it's basically equal. They're equally split. Out of the smallest 16 states, 8 of them voted for Hillary Clinton and 8 of them voted for Donald Trump. And in the largest 16 states, there was actually one more vote for Donald Trump than there was, or one more state that went for Donald Trump than went for Hillary Clinton. So again, they don't vote as a block, and so they don't really benefit from the Electoral College. So the fact is there's no large state or small state interest that needs protecting. All of our states have diverse interests, and it's a fallacy to suggest if a state goes red or blue that it represents the interests of the entire state. So the next slide, sorry. Okay, so the next slide talks about the similar thing, only in a more sort of like philosophical bent. And so people will say it protects the rights of minorities from the tyranny of the majority. And tyranny of the majority was a very popular phrase. And it's something obviously that we do get concerned about. Protecting minority rights is a critical part of the democratic society, and the founding fathers designed our government accordingly. So 2 of our 3 branches of government are specifically designed to ensure the protection of minority rights. The first is the court system. So in the courts, it is their duty to look at whether or not minority rights are being trampled on. The second is in the US Senate, which is specific about this idea that small states somehow are a minority, or that a state itself might be in a minority group. And the US Senate was designed, the reason that our houses of Congress, the Senate and the House, are designed the way they are is to avoid any tyranny of the majority, because in the US Senate, each state is equally represented. No matter how big or small, a state gets 2 senators. So the fact is that the rights of minority groups are protected by the courts, by the Constitution, by the Senate, not by the Electoral College. The president specifically is supposed to represent the interests of all Americans as fairly and equally as possible. And that means one person, one vote. The next myth is that abolishing the Electoral College is just a conspiracy by Democrats because only Democratic candidates will benefit from that. So to bust this myth, we're going to look at the 2004 presidential election. That was the Bush-Kerry election. So in 2004, you can see one of those infamous red-blue maps. George Bush won both the popular vote by 3 million more votes, and he won the Electoral College vote by 286 to 251. So it was pretty clear, but this is how close it came to having a big difference. So can you spot the difference? Now, most of us probably couldn't, so I will point out to you the only thing that I changed here was that I changed the state of Ohio and its 20 electoral votes from red to blue. If in Ohio, John Kerry had received just a little over 100,000 more votes, so that's a minuscule percentage of the vote, just over 100,000 more votes in the state of Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College, 271 to George Bush's 266. Nonetheless, Kerry would have still lost the popular vote by almost 3 million votes. So this is how close it came to a Republican winning the popular vote, but losing the Electoral College. So the fact is that this is a nonpartisan issue, which is one of the things that the League always investigates when studying its positions, is whether it has a partisan intent or impact. And here on this issue, the League firmly came down on the side of this is a nonpartisan issue. It can hurt both Republicans as well as Democrats. So moving on, those are the most popular myths. And then the next thing I want to talk about is something that we added more recently, which is we started to hear more and more people who were concerned about how the Electoral College was founded in the first place, that it was a relic of slavery. Now, we're not going to go in depth in this presentation. We have in others about the history of how the Electoral College was created. We can talk about that, but we're going to focus specifically about the impact of slavery. A lot of the Constitution was, of course, compromises between delegates who had different ideas in the first Constitutional Convention about what the government should look like. So there were a lot of compromises. Now, this compromise, which was about slavery, is one that more recently, certainly from the 20th century on, got almost no attention in the history books. So it was kind of like buried. So I want you to go back to, this is the Constitutional Convention. It was a famous painting that was done from 1787. This is that famous room where it happened from the Hamilton musical, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's right after the Americans had won their freedom from England, and they were coming together again to decide what the Constitution would look like. So there were 55 delegates representing 12 of the original 13 states. Rhode Island was upset that they thought they were too small. They didn't bother to send anybody. So all the famous names of the time, Washington, Franklin, Madison, Adams, Hamilton, among many others. And they had a lot of arguments, and it turned out one of the biggest and most divisive issues at the convention was slavery. And it actually impacted most of their debates. So let's look at what the population of those states looked like back then. So this is from the first census, the 1790 census. We can see at that time that Virginia was sort of the California of its day. It was huge compared to all the other states, you know, and places like Georgia, Rhode Island, and Delaware on the bottom were really quite tiny. So there was a lot of expectation, even among the delegates, that the big fights would break out between the big states and the small states, and there was some of that. However, as Madison wrote in the quote you can see at the bottom, about halfway through the convention, it seems now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interest lies not between the large and the small, but between the northern and southern states. And the institution of slavery and its consequences form the line of discrimination. And so Madison was one of those who expected the small state, large state fight, and instead it was a north-south fight because of slavery. And this fight was not about total population. To be sure about that, we went again back to that census, and you can see an image of that on the left. If we added up the 5 southern states, and sorry for a math issue, that should say the 8 northern states, not 7. In terms of their total population, they both had about 1.8 million people. They were roughly the same size. The difference was what that population was comprised of, which you can see on the left. Fully a third of the southern states were population of southern states was based on the enslaved people in the South. Now, the North had not completely abolished slavery in 1790, and so there were still some enslaved people in the 8 northern states. However, it was a very tiny percent. So this made a big difference. So, and again, 25 of the 55 delegates to the convention were slave owners, whether they lived north or south. They didn't seem to like to talk about it. They seemed to think that it was going to naturally go away for some strange reason. But again, as James Madison said, he told his fellow delegates that direct election of the president would be unfair to the South because the right of suffrage, the right to vote, was much more diffusive in the North because it didn't have enslaved people, and that the South could have no influence in the election of the president on the score of the Negroes. So he went on then in the same speech to make it clear that the Electoral College proposal eliminated this difficulty and seemed on the whole to be liable to fewest objections. As others have stated many times, the Electoral College was the first choice of almost nobody, but it was the second choice of many. It was a classic compromise that nobody loved. It was the last thing they figured out at convention because it was so thorny, but it was simply a compromise based on the southern states' large population of enslaved people, which made them concerned that in a popular vote for president, that they would only have, as you can see in blue, a little over 1.1 million potential votes, whereas the North would have, you know, almost their total 1.8 million. So that's how it was founded. Now, the thing is that the Electoral College continued to have a racist impact long after the founding. In fact, in the election of 1876, which was shortly after the end of the Civil War, that was a very messy election. This was, you may not remember, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel J. Tilden, not names we think about every day. When we go back and look at the records, it's pretty clear that Sam Tilden won the popular vote over Rutherford B. Hayes. But we've never heard of a President Tilden. And that's because, and this is going to sound familiar, there were allegations of voting fraud. And in 4 states, Florida, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon, both sides claimed victory. So as a result of that, Tilden didn't get a majority in the Electoral College. So the 2 parties got together and came up with a compromise again, but this one traded the newly awarded rights of Black people to shore up the malfunctioning Electoral College. This compromise allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to become president, even though he had lost the popular vote, in exchange for the removal of the federal troops who were enforcing rights for African Americans in the South. So if you don't recall, there was a brief period after the Civil War called Reconstruction. And here you can see that this is when Black people could vote, Black men could vote, pardon me, and Black representatives were sent to both the House and the Senate. But that came to an end because of this Electoral College failure in the election that we're talking about. And this compromise said that the reason, that the Reconstruction was happening is because federal troops were in the South pretty widely to make sure that Black men could go in and vote and that they would have their civil rights. This compromise of 1877 traded the South's electoral votes for removing of those federal troops from the South. And the moment that happened, the Jim Crow era started. And this was when the civil and voting rights of Black people were systematically destroyed by state laws and local ordinances, things like literacy tests, poll taxes, things like that. And it lasted for almost 100 years until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Electoral College was both created because of slavery, and it was the cause for allowing racism to continue unchecked. So we're almost done, but I want to briefly go back to the election of 2020, because that is still obviously in the national headlines and still something of major concern. Before that election, we thought we had outlined every major problem that we could find with the Electoral College, but the events of January 6th showed us that we had skipped something. And we were familiar with it, but we didn't think it was going to be a big problem. So obviously, January 6th was a pretty horrible day, but it was not the beginning. In fact, the many attempts to use the mechanism of the Electoral College to overturn the results of that election started well before January 6th. And that's because the Electoral College system itself provides these opportunities. So what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, in November and December, right after even before the final votes were being counted in November and throughout the month of December, that in mid-December, as Rosemary talked about, that is when electors physically meet in each state and in Washington, D.C. to cast their electoral votes. And usually this is pretty ceremonial, doesn't even get on the news. But while they were still finalizing the popular vote, partisan operatives were attempting to overturn election results. And the Electoral College gave them a great roadmap. And believe me, both parties have excellent analysts who can look at the Electoral College map, look at the popular votes, and then zero in on exactly where they have to change those votes and how many votes need to be changed in order to overturn the Electoral College. So what does that mean? You can see on the chart that in the popular vote, there was a difference of 7 million people. So trying to overturn a popular vote is kind of difficult. You've got to change 7 million votes in this particular election to do that. But on the electoral vote side, it comes down to you only need to change about, I'm sorry, I should have changed that, 3.5 million votes. You only have to change about half of those electoral votes, that's 74 votes. So the losing candidate was zeroing in on just 38 additional electoral votes to overturn the election. So the hunt for those votes was on. And so the Electoral College literally gives you a roadmap. So they could look at the states where the vote was close, but had gone for the other candidate and say, this is where we need to look. So Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania were the only states that they had to pay attention to. So let's just look at what happened in those 7 states. So for example, we'll look at Wisconsin. On November 18th, very shortly after the election, the losing candidate demanded a recount in just 2 selected counties. But that failed because then that recount resulted in a net gain of 87 popular votes for president. And in fact, they went in the opposite direction. They went for the Democratic candidate. So next, there was a resolution submitted to the Wisconsin state legislature to decertify the victory in Wisconsin. So that was then rejected as having no basis in law. And then on December 14th, while Wisconsin's real electors were meeting to cast the state's 10 electoral votes, electors loyal to the losing candidate also met and conducted a bogus vote for their candidate. So these kind of shenanigans were happening in all the states. I don't have time to go through all of them. A total of 63 lawsuits were filed by the losing campaign in these states and in federal courts, including the US Supreme Court. Now, luckily, they were dismissed or dropped due to lack of evidence. And these events were apparently coordinated. This is a side-by-side view of, on the left, you can see the real electoral vote certificates that have to be submitted to Congress, and on the right were the fake ones. And we can see that all of the fake certificates were printed on plain white paper with the exact same font, the same spacing, and virtually the same wording. So this is the kind of stuff that that January 6th commission is looking into and trying to decide if they were criminal events or not. But regardless of their findings, we can see that the Electoral College system itself has plenty of openings for partisan operatives to go in and try to mess with the votes. So then finally we come to January 6th. And then again, there were attempts made on that day during what used to be just a ceremonial event. 147 members of Congress voted to reject electors from Arizona and Pennsylvania. And the vice president, as we've heard, was pressured to refuse to count the electoral ballots from the 7 targeted states that we were talking about. And what that would have meant, as Rosemary pointed out, is that no candidate would receive the constitutionally mandated majority of 270 votes in the Electoral College. And so then the House of Representatives would decide which each state having 1 vote, and the losing candidates and his political party were convinced that they would win that vote. And therefore he would have been able to remain president. So how would a popular vote change this? Well, I gave you some of my simple analyses, but today I want to turn to a mathematics professor who came out with an actual number. And his analysis result, which was much fancier than anything I did, said, mathematically speaking, the Electoral College system is built to virtually ensure narrow victories, making it very susceptible to efforts to change voters' minds or the record of their choices. And in fact, in certain circumstances, the Electoral College system is 4 times more vulnerable to manipulation than a national popular vote. Now, don't ask me questions about his statistical analysis because it's too fancy for me. But even in my simple analysis, I could see that occurring. So what can you do to help abolish the Electoral College by constitutional amendment? Oops. Wow. Okay. Sorry about that. I thought I had another slide, but I didn't. So what you can do is
I apologize. I sent you the shortened one.
That's okay. So what you can do, first of all, is you can start talking to people. One of the things we need to do is to get more people aware and concerned about the Electoral College itself. Right now, of course, there's work going on in Congress to fix some of the procedural issues to try to shore it up and make it less vulnerable to manipulation. But I think of that of putting lipstick on a pig. I mean, yes, it needs to be done. I'm not saying it doesn't need to be done because it needs to be done before we have another presidential election. But the real answer is to abolish the Electoral College itself. So one thing you can do is simply help us spread the word. Any political, civil organization, we would love to go and talk to them about this. The other thing you could do is you can email us at abolishelectoral@gmail.com. And Rosemary puts out lovely little announcements once in a while. And she certainly doesn't spam anybody. She doesn't have time for that. But you can keep up to date on what we're doing. And the last thing you can do is to continue to educate yourself, ask us questions, challenge us to make sure that you are comfortable in your decision that the Electoral College should be abolished. So I'm going to end it there because I want you guys to have time to ask questions. Sorry about the alarms in the background. I live right next to an emergency room. So,
Okay, great. Joyce, if you want to stop sharing, then we can
Yes.
see everybody, or at least see the two
Yes.
of you. And I know that Jim Schuster and I think Ed Biederman, but let's start with Jim with your question.
First, let me thank you both for your presentation and the thought and care and time that went into it. It was most informative. The question I had for you is your advocacy for a direct vote system, which isn't exclusive of what I guess my question is, but I'm curious about the use of a ranked voting system and how that might fit into that, because it addresses some of the other concerns and issues perhaps as well.
Actually, yes, a rank, because I'll tell you why a ranked choice system would be useful. Some of the people have talked about if you have if you have a popular vote, you are offering more opportunity for third parties. So it's possible that the popular vote would be kind of close at the conclusion, and remember, Clinton won the election with about 40-some% of the electoral vote. It wasn't over a half. If you had a ranked choice voting system, that would make the choice much clearer and would represent the voice of the people more. We haven't tied a ranked choice voting system to abolishing the Electoral College system, but I would see in the future that would be a useful way to carry out an election. But that's too many pieces for us to focus on right now.
right.
But I agree, yes.
And the league, as of now, Rosemary, tell me if I'm wrong, the league there are certainly many league members who are looking into ranked choice voting, but the league doesn't have a position on it.
It adopted a kind of a weird position where states could make the decision themselves. So for example, the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis was able to support a ranked choice voting system for their council, their town, the village, the city council. And Maine, I think they used a ranked choice voting for their representatives, and that was also supported by the Maine League of Women Voters. So the league has given itself the ability. There are different kinds of ranked choice systems. So they didn't want to specify one particular kind. And so they kind of left it up to the locale, depending on what the election was like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ed Biederman, did you have a question? I know you raised your hand earlier on.
I don't.
Okay. Alan or Carol?
There is another movement that's been going on for a while, which would not require the difficulty of a constitutional amendment. And that is, I don't remember what it's called.
I do.
We
It's
know.
National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.
Yes.
That's what you're talking about.
It first, has the league taken a position on that, and has Illinois joined that compact?
The answer
Yes
to
and yes.
yes and yes. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is an effort by well-meaning people, because they feel that an amendment is just too hard, and they see it as a way to implement the popular vote winner. And so it was added to the league position in 2010. We, as an interim step to an amendment. So it's only as an interim step. Here's how it works, though, and you can sort of see the drawbacks a little bit. First of all, you have to have the correct number of states whose electoral votes equal 270 for it to even go into effect. So it's on its way. They've got, I forget now, 15 or 16 states. You can't say number of states because it depends how many electoral votes, are in each. So it wouldn't go into effect until they had that correct number of states. So then and Illinois was one of the first that signed on in 2008. The league did not get involved in that. The House just adopted it pretty quickly. And so what your state agrees to is that no matter how the people in your state vote, if there's a situation where the electoral vote winner is not the popular vote winner, so like 2016, no matter how your people vote, your state will choose the electors that match the winner of the popular vote. So of the national popular vote. So so it does overturn, and this is, not politicizing, it is overturning the votes of some state, because if you didn't have to do that, you wouldn't have a problem. So some state has to change the votes that its people voted for in order for the system to work. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that states can leave the compact by the compact rules within 6 months of an election. So they might decide to do it for one election, and then they might change their mind and say, we don't want to do it for the next. So that's a problem. And we believe that because the states who are not in the compact would say, what's going on here? You aren't following the system. There would be innumerable court cases that would be brought, that would delay and further divide and confuse the people. So but the league does have a position supporting it as an interim measure. We have chosen to since Illinois already adopted it, there's no need for us to advocate for it in Illinois. So we're going on and advocating for the amendment, which can happen. And I'm going to go into that one more, my favorite line. It's not in this presentation. We know that some people are never going to be convinced. And then there's this middle ground of people that maybe we can convince. But there's a group of people that support the idea, but they say, oh, it can never happen. An amendment is too hard. And that's so heartbreaking, because our own friends put up roadblocks because they think it can't happen. Well, if you think it can't, it won't. So we try to encourage people to be optimistic that if you don't try for an amendment, then of course it'll never happen. And I believe that if there are some of these vulnerabilities that are exploited by people in the future, that suddenly the mind of the people might change. Can I talk about Rudy Giuliani? If you remember from the last
Absolutely.
election, if you picture Rudy Giuliani sitting in front of the Michigan State Legislature with that lady, asking them to overturn the votes of the people, they turned him down because they did not have state of Michigan legislation allowing them to overturn the vote. So they turned him down. However, in numerous states, bills have been brought, they haven't been passed yet, have been brought that would provide enabling legislation to some of the state legislatures to allow them to overturn the vote, if they thought there was fraud or if they thought it was failed, whatever their reason might be. And the argument is that that's how it's written in the Constitution, that the state legislatures are the ones who have the ability to choose the method of choosing the electors. So if that started happening, excuse me?
I was going to say that question of the legislature without the state constitution or the state courts is up before the Supreme Court right now.
It is, but that's within the state. The U.S. Constitution already gives them the ability to overturn, to choose their electors, whatever method they want. So they don't even need that court case. It's in the Constitution. And that's the basis of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, is that provision that the state has the ability to choose the electors. If that started happening, I think all of a sudden people would be saying, what's going on? And then I think an amendment could happen rapidly.
Right.
That's my optimism.
Yes,
Right.
and I want to go back to, most of us here, I think, are old enough to remember 1968 and George Wallace and Nixon, Humphrey, and all of that. It was within a matter of just like months after that election, where they were worried that neither Humphrey nor Nixon would get a majority in the Electoral College, that this movement, supported by both Republicans and Democrats, Richard Nixon said he supported going to a popular vote because he thought that that provision in the Electoral College could lose him the presidency. Well, it turned out that didn't happen, but the vote in the House of Representatives was overwhelming. I don't remember the number in front of me, but it was like, it was huge. It was
And bipartisan.
And bipartisan. The vast, vast majority of both Republicans and Democrats voted to eliminate the Electoral College, back in 1970, 1971. The only thing that stopped it was that Southern Democrats, once again, in the Senate, were worried that, again, the Southern states would not have as much power because voter turnout was so low in the Southern states by design, that they systematically would pass laws, draw districts, do whatever they had to do so that Black voters' votes would not count in the South, and Black voters knew it. And so they either were stopped from going to the polls or they gave up going to the polls. So in a popular vote, voter turnout matters a ton in popular vote. In electoral votes, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Even if you only had a dozen people in your state who voted, the winner would get 100% of your Electoral College votes in every state but two. So again, it was Southern Democrats who stopped it. Sorry, we can go on for days and days. But
Yes, you can.
The argument was about, depending on what happens, this could happen super fast or it could take a long time. Whichever way, the league is in it for the long haul.
Good. Corey, you have a question, then I have a couple questions in the chat, but Corey, go ahead.
I do. Thank you. Great presentation. Appreciate you guys being here. My question is really to your last point. We've been, this topic comes up literally every 4 years, and it has certainly since 1968, and I'm assuming probably even before then as well. And so my question really is, what are the top 2-3 benefits of the Electoral College system? Or are we just saying this is just purely tradition and this was a compromise at best and there's no benefits?
We're having a hard time seeing the benefits. The
myths really covered it, wouldn't you say, Joyce?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. When we went through the myths, the benefits that the supporters of the Electoral College tout is this idea that it stops big cities or big states from ruling over everybody else. And the numbers just don't support that that's true. And then, they may also talk about some of the other things that we pointed out there about how it somehow protects small states. Well, it doesn't. And in fact, small states have voted to abolish the Electoral College. And there are certain large states that are having a hard time for that. So again, if you go back and think about the myths that we presented, we are not seeing any benefits to the Electoral College at all, quite frankly. So I hate to be that clear cut about it, but that's the way we see it. We haven't found one yet.
I like it.
Thank you.
Before I go to the Simons, there's a couple of questions, about how can we do this? How can we do this? I think you've answered that, but Bill Rosen says, could a rogue state legislature vote to install electors who are contrary to the results of the popular vote in that state?
Depends on the laws of the state.
Yeah.
It depends on the laws of the state. There are certain states that would be considered quite possible. Now, it would end up in the courts. And then there would be, I would assume, go to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not the provision that Rosemary is talking about can still hold true. In the past, I would have said that they would uphold and say, yes, of course, it's in the Constitution that state legislatures decide. I no longer, frankly, trust the Supreme Court to stick to those sorts of guns or not. So I don't know what would happen.
You know what? I don't think it would have to go to the Supreme Court, because look at all the states that have passed the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. that
Yeah, but it
compact.
hasn't taken effect yet, so it hasn't gone into a court case.
I
Rosemary
think-
and I have different opinions.
Yeah, I don't think it would go to, I think it's clearly laid out in the Constitution. I think there's no question that the state has that authority, but you're right, someone would challenge it. Yeah,
Someone would challenge it, and
Yeah.
I think it would end up in the Supreme Court.
but
So,
I think that
so
they would
the
have to
answer is,
validate it.
certainly maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Quite possible that that could happen.
Sandy or Mark, I'm not sure who it is.
Hello, quick question for you. Each state, of course, can determine how you vote in the state, whether or not there's early voting as an example,
Mhm.
and absentee ballots are counted, that sort of thing. What is, if you went to a national vote, if the Electoral College was abolished, what is the league's position on whether there should be some kind of national standards on how people can vote?
Yes, later in that position, Rosemary's looking it up now, I can tell.
Yeah.
Later in that position, it does say that the league supports standardized, I can't remember what the word is used. Rosemary's better at that than I am. But yes, that the standardized, a national standard for how the election is run would have to be implemented. So that, you know, when it comes to a presidential election, that there should be a national standard as to all of the things you've talked about. Who's eligible to register, when voting can start, when voting has to end, when vote counting can start and end, all of that. So we
Yeah,
think
I
that
mean,
that is an important part of it.
let's see, here's the league position. Now, this is just the league position, you understand. So not everybody listens to what the league says. Here we go. The league also supports, I gotta minimize your pictures here. The league also supports uniform voting qualifications and procedures for presidential elections. Now, that wouldn't, by the Constitution also, the states, Congress has the authority to tell the states how they should run their elections. But so far, Congress has allowed some leeway. So that could be negotiated, actually. But the league's position, we support uniform voting qualifications and procedures for presidential elections. The league supports changes in the presidential election system from the candidate selection process to the general election. We support efforts to provide voters with enough information about candidates and their positions, public policy issues, and action to ensure that the media and everybody achieve these goals and provide that information. So that's our position. But again, that could be negotiated. The Birch-Bayh Amendment actually was one of the longest amendments ever presented to the United States Congress because he included all those details in it. The current, in recent years, when they've brought these resolutions, they wind up sitting in the Judiciary Committee for the most part. They're just one sentence, that the Electoral College system shall be changed to popular vote, and then it allows for enabling legislation by the Congress. So that's all negotiable at the moment.
Carol.
Thank you for what you're doing. I agree that the Electoral College should be abolished. My question, and this may be off topic, do you have a position on gerrymandering? And if gerrymandering were fixed, would that help at all?
The league has one of its four main pillars that it's been focusing on nationwide and in the state of Illinois is to combat gerrymandered districts and provide fair maps that truly represent the people. So if you look at the Electoral College system itself is one big gerrymander, because of how it weights the electoral votes. So we think that it would fit right under the league's effort to eliminate gerrymandered districts. But that is within the states, and that's that court case that the gentleman brought up that's being considered right now, and it's really it's a redistricting case where the state legislature has passed a certain map, and their own state court said it's unconstitutional in their state, and they want to ignore the court and ignore their constitution. So yes, the league is very interested in fair maps and changing gerrymandering.
However, I do want to add that when it comes to the Electoral College or the popular vote, gerrymandering unfortunately is irrelevant because it's a winner-take-all system in all states but two. So fixing the map, no matter how you adjust the map within a gerrymandered state, no matter how you adjust the map, it's still popular vote within that state is how currently people are doing it.
But if we went to a popular vote system, it would just count all the votes in the
It would
state.
just count all the votes.
Yeah,
So
it wouldn't.
unfortunately, gerrymandering doesn't fix or hurt, in a way, presidential elections.
No,
Because
it's
it's
more
not done
congressional.
by district.
Yeah.
It has a huge impact, obviously, on the House of Representatives.
Absolutely.
So aren't there a couple of states though where it's proportional that they,
Yes,
It's
is
not
in
strictly
Nebraska
proportional.
and Maine. It's not proportional. They do it, actually, those are two states where it would matter because they do it somewhat by district. However, the league does not, specifically, the league does not support going to any kind of proportional system, because what that would allow is, again, go back to 1968. George Wallace was a very popular regional third-party candidate, not nationally, but regionally. And so the concern is that a third-party candidate in the Electoral College system could pick off enough votes so that neither of the two major parties would get the majority, the 270 votes. And then per the Constitution, it goes into the House of Representatives with each state getting one vote. So as you've heard us rag on that off, so much, we hate the thought of that. And proportional voting within the Electoral College mathematically greatly increases the chances of that happening. So again, some well-meaning people are saying that this would help. And it would make the Electoral College vote more similar to a popular vote than it is right now, but then it opens the door to this other problem. So, you get a complicated system, it causes complicated problems. A simple system like everybody votes, everybody gets one vote, and you count up the votes, whoever gets the most wins. I mean, that's pretty simple. Electoral College, it's complicated.
Well, we can't thank you for all the information you have imparted to us this morning, all of the work, all of the good work that the League of Women Voters does. And I think if there is a moral, I know we're preaching to the choir here, but get out and vote, get out and get other people to vote. We have envelopes at the congregation that go out to some of these swing states that were highlighted in one of those slides. So we want the more people to vote. So it is reflective of the entire United States. I put in the chat, don't forget, it's Sukkah open house for Rabbi. And it's great seeing everyone. Chag Sameach. I hope that you have a good Sukkot. Rosemary and Joyce, thank you. Thank you. What a great presentation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everybody.
This is what we're trying to do. We reach out to any size group because we want to keep the conversation on the front burner instead of, as was pointed out, forgetting about it till the next time around. We want to keep this
Here,
going.
here.
So
Okay,
thank
be
you.
well, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.